Forge gang, I'm still a hard man. All right. This is the Proclaimers of Jehovah's Kingdom, or Proclaimers of God's Kingdom, Chapter 4. The Great Apostasy develops. I will be skipping a very huge section of time. This is not necessarily a historical undertaking, but it's just more a development and interpretation of a theological doctrine. So before I get started, I'm going to show a screenshot of a book from the 1700s that predates the Restorationist movement of the 1800s and the Second Great Awakening. This is The Great Apostasy from Christianity with its evil influence on the civil state, wherein is proved that popery, in its nature, destroys the vitals and essentials of true religion, that a popish prince and a Protestant nation cannot fulfill together. And this is by one John Brighton, chaplain to His Grace, the Duke of Marlborough, and lecturer of St. Andrew Holborn, London, printed for D. Midwinter at the Three Crowns of St. Paul's Churchyard, 1718. This book was printed in 1718, and there are books that mention a great apostasy that go even further back than that. So this proves that the great apostasy is not a Jacobin invention, because Jacobins did not exist in 1718. Even John Owen and William Manton spoke of the great apostasy. Anyway, back to our normal underlining. So, Chapter 4, The Great Apostasy develops. One Lord, one faith. Ephesians 4:5. When the Apostle Paul, under inspiration, penned those words about 60 to 61 CE, there was but one Christian faith. Yet today, we see a profusion of denominations, sects, and cults that claim to be Christian, though they teach conflicting doctrines and hold claim to be Christian, though they teach conflicting doctrines and hold to different standards of conduct. So when the Apostle Paul, under inspiration, penned those words, there was but one Christian faith, just as up until the Tower of Babel, or the Tower of Babel, there was but only one language on the entire face of the earth. Yet, as a result of the confounding of tongues, there were many languages, and so is the same with Christianity. There was but one Christian faith. Yet today we see a profusion of denominations, sects, and cults that claim to be Christian, though they teach conflicting doctrines and hold to different standards of conduct. What a far cry from the one united Christian congregation that started on Pentecost 33 CE. How did these divisions come about? For the answer, we must go back to the first century of our common era. From the very beginning, the adversary, Satan, tried to silence the testimony of the Christian witnesses of Jehovah by bringing upon them persecution from those outside the congregation. 1 Peter 5:8. First, it came from the Jews and then from the Gentile Roman Empire. The early Christians successfully endured all manner of opposition. Compare Revelation 1:9 to 3:19. But the adversary did not give up. If he could not silence them by pressure from those on the outside, why not corrupt them from within? While the Christian congregation was still in its infancy, its very existence was threatened by an internal enemy, apostasy. Apostasy, however, did not creep into the congregation unannounced. As head of the congregation, Christ saw to it that his followers were warned in advance. Colossians chapter 1, verse 18. While still in its infancy, the Christian congregation was threatened by apostasy. There will be false teachers among you. Internal opposition had small beginnings. There will be false teachers among you. Be on the watch, cautioned Jesus, for the false prophets that come to you in sheep's covering. Matthew 7:15. Jesus knew that Satan would try to divide and corrupt his followers. So, from early in his ministry, he warned about false teachers. From where would these false teachers come? From among you yourselves, said the Apostle Paul about 56 CE, when speaking to overseers of Ephesus. Yes, from within the congregation, men would rise and speak twisted things to draw away the disciples after themselves. In the Christian Greek scriptures, the noun apostasy, Greek apostasias, has the sense of desertion, abandonment, or rebellion, Acts chapter 21, verse 21, footnote. There it primarily has reference to religious defection, a withdrawal from or abandonment of true worship. Acts 20, yes, from within the congregation, men would rise and speak twisted things to draw away the disciples after themselves. Acts 20, 29, 30. Such self-seeking apostates would not be content to make their own disciples. They would endeavor to draw away the disciples, that is, Christ's disciples. The Apostle Peter, about 64 CE, also foretold internal corruption and even described the way such apostates would operate. There will be false teachers among you. These very ones will quietly bring in destructive sects. With covetousness, they will exploit you with counterfeit words. 2 Peter 2, 1, 3. Like spies or traitors in an enemy's camp, the false teachers, though arising from within the congregation, would infiltrate their corrupting views in a secret or camouflaged way. These warnings of Jesus and his apostles were not in vain. Internal opposition had small beginnings, but it surfaced early in the Christian congregation. Already at work, less than 20 years after Jesus' death, the Apostle Paul indicated that efforts of Satan to cause division and turn men away from the true faith were already at work. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7. As early as about 49 CE, in a letter sent out to the congregations, the governing body noted, "We have heard that some from among us have caused you trouble with speeches, trying to subvert your souls, although we did not give them any instructions." Acts 15:24. So some within the congregation were vocal about their opposing viewpoint. In this case, evidently over the issue of whether Gentile Christians needed to get circumcised and observe the Mosaic law. Acts 15:1-5. Has the first century progressed, Divisive thinking spread like gangrene. Gangrene. Compare 2 Timothy 2:17. By about 51 CE, some in Thessalonica were wrongly predicting that the presence of the Lord Jesus was imminent. 2 Thessalonians 2:1-2. By about 55 CE, some in Corinth had rejected the clear Christian teaching regarding the resurrection of the dead. 1 Corinthians 15:12. About 65 CE, others said that the resurrection had already taken place, it being of a symbolic kind that living Christians experience. 2 Timothy 2:16-18. There are no inspired records as to what took place. There are no inspired records as to what took place within the Christian congregation during the next 30 years. But by the time the Apostle John wrote his letters about 98 CE, there were many antichrists, persons who denied that Jesus is the Christ and that Jesus is the Son of God who came in the flesh. 1 John 2:18, 22:4-3. For over 60 years, the apostles had acted. For over 60 years, the apostles had acted as a restraint, endeavoring to hold back the tide of apostasy. 2 Thessalonians 2:7. Compare also 2 John 9:10. But as the Christian congregation was about to enter the 2nd century, the last surviving apostle, John, died about 100 CE. The apostasy that had slowly begun to creep into the congregation was now ready to burst forth unrestrained, with devastating organizational and doctrinal repercussions. And it is truly sad indeed, after all the amazing work that the apostles did, all of the successful conversions, the preaching of the good news throughout the entire known world of that day, that something like this happened. But the false witnesses, the false preachers, and the antichrists were very persistent. And the Simon Maguses, the Simon the magicians were very persistent. And they kept up their work. They kept up their dark efforts. Clergy and laity, all you are brothers. Jesus had said to his disciples, your leader is one, the Christ. Matthew 23:8-10. So there was no clergy class within Christian congregations of the first century. Has Spirit anointed brothers of Christ. All the early Christians had the prospect of being heavenly priests with Christ. Has Spirit anointed brothers of Christ. All the early Christians had the prospect of being heavenly priests with Christ. 1 Peter 1:3, 4:2-5-9. As to organization, each congregation was supervised by a body of overseers or spiritual elders. All the elders had equal authority, and not one of them was authorized to lord it over the flock in their care. Acts chapter 20, verse 17. Philemon chapter 1, verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. However, as the apostasy unfolded, things began to change quickly. Among the earliest deviations was a separation between the terms overseer, Greek episkopos, an older man or elder, Greek presbyteros, so that they were no longer used to refer to the same position of responsibility. Just a decade or so after the death of the Apostle John, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, in his letter to the Cyrenians, Bishop of Antioch, in his letter to the Cyrenians, wrote, "See that you all follow the bishop, overseer, as Jesus Christ follows the Father, and the presbytery, body of older men, as if it were the apostles." Ignatius thus advocated that each congregation be supervised by one bishop or overseer, who was to be recognized as distinct from and having greater authority than the presbyters or older men. How, though, did this separation come about? Augustus Neander, in his book, The History of the Christian Religion and Church, during the 3 first centuries, explains what happened. In the 2nd century, the standing office of president of the presbyters must have been formed, to whom, inasmuch as he had especially the oversight of everything, was the name of Episcopos given, and he was thereby distinguished from the rest of the presbyters. There is no such position as a bishop separate from the presbytery in the first century of the apostles. All of these offices were artificially created without inspiration in the second century. Caprian, bishop of Carthage. Caprian, bishop of Carthage, saw the bishops as being a class separate from the presbyters, the deacons, and the laity. The groundwork was thus laid for the clergy class gradually to emerge. About a century later, Caprian, bishop of Carthage, North Africa, was a strong advocate of authority of the bishops, as a group separate from the presbyters, later known as priests, the deacons, and the laity. In the scriptures, the term overseer and older man or elder refer to the same position. Acts 20, 17, 28. Titus 1:5-7. Older man indicates the mature qualities of the one so appointed. An overseer, the responsibility inherent in the appointment, watching over the interests of those persons entrusted in one's care. The English word bishop derives from the Greek term episkopos, overseer, as follows from Middle English bishop, from Old English biskop, from Vulgar Latin biskopus, variant of Late Latin episcopus, from Greek episkopos. But he did not favor the primacy of one bishop over the others. As bishops and presbyters ascended the hierarchical ladder, they left below it the rest of the believers in the congregation. This resulted in a separation between clergy, those taking the lead, and laity, the passive body of believers, explains McClintock and Strong's Encyclopedia. From the time of Caprian, who died about 258 CE, the father of the hierarchical system, the distinction of clergy and laity became prominent, and very soon was universally admitted. Indeed, from the 3rd century onward, the term clerus was almost exclusively applied to the ministry to distinguish it from the laity. As the Roman hierarchy was developed, the clergy came to be not merely a distinct order, but also to be recognized as the only priesthood. Thus, within 150 years or so of the death of the last of the apostles, two significant organizational changes found their way into the congregation. First, the separation between the bishop and the presbyters, with the bishop occupying the top rung of the hierarchical ladder. Second, the separation between the clergy and the laity. Instead of all Spirit-begotten believers forming a royal priesthood, the clergy were now recognized as the only priesthood. 1 Peter 2:9. Such changes marked a defection from the scriptural method of governing the congregations in apostolic days. Organizational changes, though, were not the only consequences of the apostasy. Plato and Christianity. The Greek philosopher Plato, born about 428 BCE, had no way of knowing that his teachings would eventually find their way into apostate Christianity. Plato's principal contributions to Christianity were in connection with the teachings of the Trinity and the immortality of the soul. Plato's ideas about God and nature influenced Christendom's Trinity doctrine, explains the Nouveau Dictionnaire Universal. The Platonic Trinity itself, merely a rearrangement of older trinities dating back to earlier peoples, appears to be the rational, philosophic trinity of attributes that gave birth to the three hypostases, or divine persons taught by the Christian churches. This Greek philosopher's conception of the divine Trinity can be found in all the ancient pagan religions. Volume 2, page 1467. Regarding the immortal soul doctrine, the New Catholic Encyclopedia says, "The Christian concept of a spiritual soul created by God and infused into the body at conception to make man a living whole is the fruit of a long development in Christian philosophy. Only with Origen died about 254 CE in the East, and St. Augustine died 430 CE in the West, was the soul established as a spiritual substance and a philosophical concept formed of its nature. Augustine's doctrine owed much, including some shortcomings to Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism, Volume 13, page 452-454. The English word priest derives from preshyteros, older man or elder, as follows from Middle English, priest. From Old English, pretost. From Vulgar Latin, prester. Contracted from Late Latin, presbyter. From Greek, preshyteros. In time, the Bishop of Rome, claiming to be a successor of Peter, was thought of as the supreme bishop and pope. See Mankind's Search for God, published by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York, Incorporated, 1990, pages 270-72. Interestingly, Dr. Neander observes the false conclusion was drawn that as there had been in the Old Testament a visible priesthood joined to a particular class of men, there must also be the same in the New Testament. The false comparison of the Christian priesthood with the Jewish furthered again the rise of episcopacy above the office of presbyters. The History of the Christian Religion and Church, translated by Henry John Rose, 2nd edition, New York, 1848, page 111. Pagan teachings infiltrate. Christ's pure teachings are a matter of record. They are preserved in the Holy Scriptures. For example, Jesus clearly taught that Jehovah is the only true God, and that the human soul is mortal. John 17:3, Matthew 10:20. Matthew 10:28. Yet, with the death of the apostles and the weakening of the organizational structure, such clear teachings were corrupted as pagan doctrines infiltrated Christianity. How could such a thing happen? A key factor was the subtle influence of Greek philosophy. Explains the New Encyclopedia Britannica. From the middle of the 2nd century AD, Christians who had some training in Greek philosophy began to feel the need to express their faith in its terms, both for their own intellectual satisfaction and in order to convert educated pagans. Once philosophically minded persons became Christians, it did not take long for Greek philosophy and Christianity to become inseparably linked. As a result of this union, pagan doctrines such as the Trinity and the immortality of the soul seeped into tainted Christianity. These teachings, however, go back much further than the Greek philosophers. The Greeks actually acquired them from older cultures, for there is evidence of such teachings in ancient Egyptian and Babylonian religions. As pagan doctrines continued to infiltrate Christianity, other scriptural teachings were also distorted or abandoned. Not only did apostates transfer millennial blessings from earth to heaven, but they shifted the kingdom from heaven to earth. Kingdom hope fades. Jesus' disciples were well aware that they had to keep on the watch. Jesus' disciples were well aware that they had to keep on the watch for Jesus' promised presence and the coming of his kingdom. In time, it was appreciated that this kingdom will rule over the earth for 1,000 years and transform it into a paradise. Matthew 24:3, 2 Timothy 4:18, Revelation 24:6. The Christian Bible writers exhorted first-century witnesses to keep spiritually awake and to keep separate from the world. Separate from the world. Jude 1:27-44, 5781. 1 Peter 4:7. But once the apostles died, Christian expectation of Christ's presence and the coming of his kingdom faded. Why? One factor was the spiritual contamination caused by the Greek doctrine of the immortality of the soul. As it took hold among Christians, the millennial hope was gradually abandoned. Why? The New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology explains, the doctrine of the immortality of the soul came in to take the place of New Testament eschatology, the teaching on the last things, with its hope of the resurrection of the dead and the new creation. Revelation chapter 21, chief footnote. so that the soul receives judgment after death, and attains to paradise now thought of as otherworldly. In other words, apostate Christians thought that the soul survived the body at death, and that the blessings of Christ's millennial reign must therefore relate to the spirit realm. They thus transferred paradise from earth to heaven, which they believed the saved soul attains at death. There was then no need to watch for Christ's presence and the coming of his kingdom, since at death they all hope to join Christ in heaven. Another factor, though, actually made it seem to be pointless to watch for the coming of Christ's kingdom. The New Encyclopedia Britannica explains the apparent delay of the parousia resulted in the weakening of the imminent expectation in the early church. In this process of de-eschatologizing, weakening of the teaching on the last things, the institutional church increasingly replaced the expected kingdom of God. The formation of the Catholic Church as a hierarchical institution is directly connected with the declining of the imminent expectation. Italics R's. So not only were millennial blessings transferred from earth to heaven, but the kingdom was shifted from heaven to earth. This relocation was completed by Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 CE. In his famous work, The City of God, he stated, "The church even now is the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of heaven." Meanwhile, in about 313 CE, during the rule of Roman Emperor Constantine, legal recognition was given to Christianity, much of which by this time had become apostate in its thinking. Religious leaders were willing to be put into the service of the state, and at first the state controlled religious affairs. Before long, religion would control state affairs. Thus began Christendom, part of which, the Catholic religion, in time became the official state religion of Rome. Now the kingdom not only was in the world, but was part of the world. What a far cry from the kingdom that Christ preached. John 18:36. The church even now is the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of heaven. Augustine of Hippo. The Reformation, a return to true worship. Like weeds flourishing in among strangled wheat, the Church of Rome, under its papal ruler, dominated worldly affairs for centuries. This view mistakenly presumes that at death all Christians go to heaven. However, the Bible teaches that only 144,000 persons are called to rule with Christ in heaven. Revelation 7:4-8, 20:4-6. Countless others can have the hope of everlasting life on a paradise earth under Christ's kingdom. Matthew 6:10, Matthew 6:10, Revelation 7:9-15, has used in this publication the term Christendom refers to professed Christianity. Refers to professed Christianity, in contrast to the true Christianity of the Bible. For centuries, Matthew 13:24-30, 37-43, as it became more and more a part of the world, the church grew further and further away from first century Christianity. Through the centuries, heretical sects called for reforms within the church, but the church continued to abuse power and amass wealth. Then, in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, a religious revolt, burst forth in all its fury. Reformers such as Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, Ulrich Zwingli, 1484 to 1531, and John Calvin, 1509 to 64, attacked the church on various issues. Luther on the sale of indulgences, Zwingli on clerical celibacy and Mariolatry, and Calvin on the need for the church to return to the original principles of Christianity. What did such efforts accomplish? To be sure, the Reformation accomplished some good things, most notably the translation of the Bible into languages of the common people. The free spirit of the Reformation led to more objective Bible research and an increased understanding of Bible languages. The Reformation did not, however, mark a return to true worship and doctrine. Why not? The effects of the apostasy had penetrated deep to the very foundations of Christendom. Thus, although various Protestant groups broke free from the papal authority of Rome, they carried over some of the basic flaws of the Roman Catholic Church, features that resulted from the abandonment of true Christianity. For example, although the governing of the Protestant churches varied somewhat, the basic division of the church into a dominating clergy class and a subjugated laity was retained. Also retained were unscriptural doctrines such as the Trinity, the immortal soul, and eternal torment after death. And like the Roman Church, the Protestant churches continued to be part of the world, being closely involved with the political systems and the elite ruling classes. Meanwhile, what about Christian expectation, watching for Jesus' presence and the coming of his kingdom? For centuries after the Reformation, the churches, both Catholic and Protestant, were deeply committed to secular power and tended to push off expectations of the coming of Christ's kingdom. All right, so we have here a brass plate of Martin Luther. This is Martin Luther translating the New Testament into German. We have here a picture of John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, reformers who attacked the church on various issues. For a fuller discussion of the Reformation and what it accomplished, see chapter 13. The Reformation, the search took a new turn in the book, Mankind's Search for God. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto actually fostered worship of the state. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species deeply influenced the scientific and religious thinking of the time. Stirrings of watchfulness. In the 19th century, though the religious climate led to stirrings of Christian watchfulness, as a result of Bible research on the part of some clergymen and Bible scholars, such teachings has the immortal soul, eternal torment after death, predestination, and the Trinity were restudied. In addition, some students of the Bible were closely examining Bible prophecies pertaining to the last days. Consequently, various groups of persons began thinking seriously about the Lord's promised return. Matthew 24:3. In the United States, William Miller predicted the return of Christ in visible form in 1843 or 1844. The German theologian J.A. Bengel set the date for 1836. The Arvanites in England looked first to 1835, and then 1838, 1864, and 1866. There was a Mennonite group in Russia that looked first to 1889, then to 1891. Such efforts to keep on the watch served to awaken many to the prospect of our Lord's return. However, these efforts at Christian watchfulness ended up in disappointment. Why? For the most part, because they relied too much on men and not enough on the scriptures. After a few decades, most of those groups faded out of existence. Meanwhile, during this period, other developments had an impact on human hopes and expectations. The age of enlightenment and industrialization. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto. Instead of advocating religion, which Marx called the opium of the people, they advocated atheism. While ostensibly against all religion, they actually fostered the religion or worship of the state and its leaders. About a decade later, in 1859, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was published. It deeply influenced the scientific and religious thinking of the time. The theories of evolution led to a challenging of the truthfulness of the Bible's account of creation and of the introduction of sin through the disobedience of the first human pair, Genesis chapters 1 to 3. As a result, faith of many in the Bible was undermined. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was underway and gaining momentum. Emphasis switched from agriculture to industry and machine manufacture. The development of the steam locomotive, early 19th century, was leading to expansion of countrywide railroads. The latter half of the 19th century saw the invention of the telephone. 1876, the phonograph. 1877, the electric light. 1878 to 79, as well as the use of linotype in producing lines of type for printing, 1884. Mankind was entering a period of the greatest development of rapid transportation and communication in history. Although these benefits would be used to advance commercial and political ends, they would also be available to the religious field. The stage was set for a modest initiative by a small group of Bible students that would have worldwide effects. This is the steam locomotive, the electric light, the first telephone, early linotype, and the phonograph. All right, so this has been Chapter 4, The Great Apostasy Develops. Next time, I will go to Chapter 5, Proclaiming the Lord's Return, 1870 through 1914. That will be the next chapter that I will be covering. All right, so are there any questions in regards to the great apostasy? The obvious fact that the church fell away from the truthfulness and bearing the one true witness of the absolute and honest gospel of Jesus Christ, and the absolute unabated fact that the church did in fact fall into apostasy. All right. Hey, Supernaturally Panda, how are you doing? I hope you're okay. I hope you're doing okay. Supernaturally Panda says, heyo. Hey, what's up? Supernaturally Panda says, I found some peeps for you. Thank you so much. Supernaturally Panda says, I am going to send you some stuff to watch. Alright, so next time I'll cover chapter 5, Proclaiming the Lord's Imminent Return. I am your host, Imperator of Forge, otherwise known as Forge Warhammer, and thank you for watching. Forge Gang! I am still a hard man! Stay hard!